Hey everybody, this is Nestor Diaz with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, and this is PGCMLS This Week. Now, all week long, we'll be celebrating and embracing the spirit of Juneteenth with virtual events and resources that our fantastic team has put together. Tuesday at 6 p.m., join PGCMLS staff member Tashi for a cooking program with historical information about Juneteenth. Then, at 7 p.m., we have Beyond the Year of Return in Ghana, Reflections and Opportunities. Author Dwayne A. Ratliff discusses his book, Dancing to the Lyrics, with Michelle Hamill of PGCMLS, Wednesday at 7 p.m. In Ratliff's book, Grant Cole, an African-American gay youth, struggles to comprehend his own nature, his world, and the adults who populate it. On Thursday at 11 a.m., this month's Golden 30, our online and over-the-phone program, focuses on advocacy in a health crisis. This presentation for older adults will help you know your rights and how to enforce them when you are in the hospital. In Voices of Woodlawn, poets give voice to the erased lives of slaves of Woodlawn, a Fairfax, Virginia plantation that is now a historic estate. Maryland poets Diane Wilburn Parks, Patrick Washington, Sylvia Diane, Lady Di Beverly, and Hiram LaRue confront the sadness, anger, injustice, and confusion of such a past and its haunting legacy. They are joined by poet and harmonica player Cliff Bernier in a powerfully unsettling Juneteenth program of witness. Kids and teens, engage in a fun experiment with fruits, draw a family tree, and see how it all connects to DNA during this week's special Juneteenth STEM at Home, Friday at noon. Then, at 7 p.m. on PGCMLS Book Talk, hear all about the title Kindred by Octavia Butler. This landmark novel forever changed the way we think about what science fiction can do.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Griffin of PGCMLS. I'm here at the library in the town of Fairmont Heights, one of the first planned communities for African American families in the country. Visit Fairmont Heights to check out our branch, to walk the town's heritage trail, and to learn more about the African Americans who have made our county such a great place to live and work. In celebration of Juneteenth, the library system will be closed on Saturday, June 19th.
Thanks for watching, and be sure to visit pgcmls.info/heritage to learn more about Juneteenth and Black history as a whole. Feel free to like and share this video, and we'll see you next week. But until then, have a good one.
Greetings, everyone in the interwebs. It is Monday night, post-Pride weekend here in the DC area. My name is Nick Brown. I use the pronouns he, him. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Communication and Outreach at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And I am here with some fabulous, fabulous colleagues. Not only are they fabulous to work with and fabulous community leaders, but they have fabulous hair, and which is far more exciting than mine, and they'll tell you all about what they do for the library system here in a second. Just want to let you know some ground rules before we get started here. We have a chat feed and comment feed on the 3 platforms where we're broadcasting tonight. We encourage you to chime in and chat with us through the program. You're welcome to post questions there, and we'll address them as we go throughout tonight. This is a very special program as part of our overall Pride at PGCMLS series, which is a year-long programming initiative to make sure that LGBTQ plus stories and journeys are represented, both those of folks who live in our community and those around the world, so that we can all learn how to be better neighbors to each other and make sure that everyone has the support that they need to live their authentic selves and feel safe in our library community. So thank you for being here and being a part of this conversation tonight. We are really excited. I'm going to invite Rebecca Oxley to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Happy Pride. My name is Rebecca. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the librarian 3 at the Greenbelt branch, and I'm also on the LGBTQ work team at Prince George's County Memorial Library System.
Hey, I'm Chris. I'm pronouns are he, him. I'm a youth services librarian at the Bowie branch, library associate, and also on the LGBTQ team.
Awesome. How long have both of you worked for our library system?
I have been with the library system for almost 5 years. Before that, I was a school librarian and technology teacher with Prince George's County Public Schools.
And I've been going on a bit over 15 since 2005. Yeah, pretty much needed a job after college and had decided, hey, let's go back to the library. So it's been good.
Very cool. And before we get started on the meat and potatoes of our program here tonight, today was a very special day for the library in our progression towards getting folks back into our buildings. Could you both talk about what happened today so folks know that they can access the library again?
Absolutely. We are very excited. We went into phase 3 of our reopening strategy, our tiered reopening strategy. So today at Greenbelt, the children's room was open and available. The entire collection, unlimited browsing is available for you. We have more computers available and there are no appointments needed. Lots of self-service, including checkout, scanning, and printing. We have information and circulation staff ready at the desk to assist you. We are no longer quarantining materials, so there's no wait and wondering about when your materials have been checked in. And our single study rooms are open for 2-hour sessions once per day.
Very cool.
Great. We had a lot of customers they loved that we're back open on all floors. It was great to see the kids going through the children's area, just getting all the books they wanted off the shelves. And it was, really good to be able to actually sit adjacent to customers, help them with the computers, because we know a lot of our customers are trying to go through government websites, get job applications. And so we can actually take the time to fully help them again.
Awesome. So our goal tonight is to explore 100 years of fierce LGBTQ plus women activists through primary documents from places like the Library of Congress, Lesbian Herstory Archives, and popular culture. We're not going to be able to do anything comprehensive, but we chose a handful of individuals who we're going to talk about and possibly get into some more as we get through the discussion. The goal here is to just kind of some awareness and some love about some really awesome people who have played an important and very direct role in helping our society move forward over the past 100 years. And just a caveat before we get into that is that, those of us who are members of the LGBTQ plus community on this program, we really represent our own journeys and our own experiences, and there are numerous, countless, infinite number of experiences that differ from ours. And we, for example, don't represent the trans, Black, or brown woman experience with the panelists on tonight. And we just want to be very clear that we are not attempting to speak on behalf of other members of the community. We're coming to the table with our own experiences and our own interests in this as a study, and really hope that this is an opportunity for folks.
Uh-oh. While we're waiting for Nick to come back with us, we just wanted to mention that since we will be talking about eras long past, there's going to be some vocabulary that is outdated. We're essentially using retroactive labels to better understand these women's place in their own time and space on the political stage. Just a warning, some people might find these terms triggering as they're no longer terms that are acceptable to use today.
Yeah, there were trans women in the past that used terminology that describes themselves in their lives that maybe we don't use today, but we recognize that they were speaking about their own experiences in that era.
Well, I guess we'll just go ahead and dive right in. Oh, Nick's back.
Hopefully I'll stay back. Sorry about that. I don't know when it cut out, but I think
no worries.
Cool. So let's just blaze forward. Is there anything else that you guys are, sorry, bad terminology, that you all would like to cover before we jump into the topics?
We just gave a little caveat about some of the terminology that we're using might be triggering to some of our viewers because, for very obvious reasons, we no longer use those terms. However, these were terms that these women often used to self-describe themselves to and better paint a picture of their experience as LGBTQ women in Western culture.
Cool. I just want to apologize for saying you guys. I know that's something that we're all striving to be better about not saying. So that is one of the things that I've been working on and need to continue to work on because it is not the most inclusive terminology for sure. So apologies for that to my colleagues and to any viewers. Okay, so we are kicking things off with a very fabulous person named Miss Josephine. I'm going to get our screen share up here. And if for some reason my signal goes out again, Rebecca and Chris will keep the train moving.
Okay. Well, I am very excited to be talking about Josephine Baker, who has been a hero of mine since childhood. Josephine Baker was born in 1906, so the turn of last century, in St. Louis. And she began working from the age of 8, which was not uncommon at that time. This was before a lot of child labor laws were in place. So she worked quite a bit of domestic jobs, and she worked in restaurant and then finally broke into the entertainment industry, where she got some dancing roles. But her life really catapulted into this meteoric state when she traveled to Paris. So unlike the completely racist, white supremacist, terrible system and Jim Crow and everything else, and non-recognition of women's rights that we're experiencing in the United States at that time, when she went to Paris, she was essentially, she described feeling liberated because people would judge her for her talent and herself and her vibrance and vivaciousness. So the famous La Revue Negre, or the Danse Sauvage, I'm sure people recognize that is the dance that she was essentially naked and wearing a dress or skirt rather made of bananas. She also wore that skirt in the Folies Bergère cabaret. We're fast forwarding to like the 1920s. So she's in her mid 20s. She started singing in the 1930s. And then, after great celebrity and acclaim in Paris, she returned to the United States for just a poor reception. Essentially, she came back to being this othered person once she returned to the United States. So she actually became a French citizen through marriage in 1937. And she is the B in the LGBTQ plus. She was a famously noted bisexual. She had an affair famously with another one of my favorite bicons, Frida Kahlo. I believe that scene was creatively explored in the movie Frida, the biopic Frida. And here's where she becomes a complete badass. So World War II has hit, and she's in the French resistance. So she's a celebrity in France, in Europe, period, but certainly in France, everybody knows who she is. But she became a spy at tremendous danger to herself. She was known for smuggling messages in invisible ink, and also smuggling messages in sheet music, so that when she was stomped, she could say, "Oh, this is just sheet music," or "Oh, these are just blank pages." She also took surreptitious photographs of German weaponry and hid them in her underwears. She also was famously known for hiding Jews in her and armaments, like weaponry, in her chateau. She actually received 3 military honors from France. Later on in the 1950s, she worked for the NAACP, and she is credited officially with desegregating Las Vegas before Sammy Davis Jr. And in Las Vegas, they actually declared May 20th, 1951, Josephine Baker Day. So this is all the way back in 1951. So this is certainly a landmark achievement. She also is well known in her later life for adopting a dozen children from diverse ethnic backgrounds. She was very adamant about proving that integration was possible and was for the betterment of society. She called her family the Rainbow Tribe, which is certainly apropos given what we know now about her sexuality. And she fundraised tirelessly for anti-racist organizations in France. This is a small known fact to some people. She is the only woman to have spoken at the March on Washington in 1963, which is where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously gave his I Have a Dream speech. And then she lived out the end of her life in Monaco at the invitation of Princess Grace Kelly. And she actually passed away in Paris in luxury in 1975. So like many women, she did much more politically and even militarily than was advisable for a woman in her position at that time. And if we're taking a look at some of the primary sources that we have up on the screen, these primary sources are all from the Library of Congress. The first artifact is labeled number 1. It is a cigarette card. It's undated, but possibly it's from the 1920s. And she's doing what's called her cheesecake pose, which is a very, very famous pose. And for anybody who's wondering what a cigarette card is, people smoked like crazy back then, and they would actually have trading cards in people's cigarette packs, and usually of celebrities. In the second cigarette card, she is a ballerina on point. Many people were not aware that she had this kind of classical dance training, but she was wildly multi-talented. The third picture is Josephine Baker at the French Gratitude Train activities. So the French Gratitude Train was literally a train that was filled with celebrities, kind of like a USO kind of thing, where people could just give thanks to all the people who had fought in World War II and the people who had struggled privately, maybe who weren't enlisted in the military. They think that this photograph is from maybe 1948 or 1949. So you can see how celebrated she was, that she was one of the few celebrities chosen to participate on this gratitude train. And then the last one I love, this is Josephine Baker and Lena Horne having a conversation at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The photograph is from 1963. And the quote that I really enjoyed, of all the many quotes I found, was, "All my life, I have maintained that the people of the world can learn to live together in peace if they are not brought up in prejudice."
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing a bit about the life of Josephine Baker. And so interesting how, the people who we know the most about tend to be related to the generations in which we're immediately adjacent or part of coming up. And like Josephine would have been, I don't know, maybe at the level of Janelle Monáe or Beyonce in terms of people knowing who she is in popular culture, but to us now, she's this figure in history. And it's also interesting to talk about her in the context of our Rainbow Warriors conversation. So often in kind of the mainstream society understanding of the queer rights movement in the United States, we're starting at Stonewall, and that's a really important inflection point, but it was a flashpoint that really accelerated a lot. But there were decades and decades and many years of queer activism happening all over the world by Americans way before that, even going back into the 19th century. So thank you so much for highlighting this fabulous diva who was, you don't get more subversive than spying against the Axis powers, and how cool that she was able to play a direct role in that really significant conflict. Her recordings are also available on Freegal, which is our streaming music service, and you can download a few tracks each week to keep for your own private collection, as well as stream up to 3 hours per day. So check out her recordings on Freegal, available with your PTC MLS card. Okie dokie. Anything else on Josephine?
No, but I do want to mention that we have a fantastic and deliciously large graphic novel biography about Josephine Baker. I'm trying to remember the author and illustrator. I think it was a Latinx fellow and a French illustrator. But I've been told by people who I've seen during the pandemic at our curbside that it's really fantastic read. So feel free to look that up in our catalog.
Super. I'm going to try and find a link to that catalog record while we're going here on the next character, who is going to be that fabulous playwright who we all know, but maybe some of us didn't know that they were a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So next up here, we have Lorraine Hansberry.
Okay, so Lorraine Hansberry was born in 1930 in Chicago to Carl Augustus Hansberry and Nanny Perry Hansberry. And her father was a political activist in Chicago, and specifically in the realms of legal and real estate efforts against discrimination. When she was about 8, he moved the family to a pretty much solely white segregated neighborhood in Chicago to challenge the segregation as it stood. He figured, if I can afford to buy a house in this neighborhood, me and my family can move there. And so they did. However, of course, the family was unfortunately threatened. They were discriminated against. Their house was, at one point, a mob assaulted it. A brick missed Lorraine's head by that much. And he ended up taking this to court. He took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1940 in Hansberry versus Lee. At the time, the court found against him in a technicality, but later cases prevailed for the family. But by that, in the terms of other people being able to move into integrated neighborhoods. But at a certain point, her father was demoralized by the racism in America, and he planned to move the family to Mexico. However, when he was there in 1946, setting up the move, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. Her father's championing of Black families' integration and acceptance into every neighborhood in America, and the perils that her family went through, basically laid the groundwork for her famed play, A Raisin in the Sun. And she studied theater in high school, and she later went to Chicago and Mexico to study painting. And by 1950, she went to New York, where she began writing for a progressive magazine that was founded by the activist, singer, and actor Paul Robeson. And in New York, she met a Jewish white man who shared similar progressive politics named Robert Nemiroff. And they married in, about 1953. And he was often a first reader for her. And so through the years, she was writing articles, she was writing theater work, and she was starting to write for the civil rights movement as she was working on A Raisin in the Sun. And the title did come from a Langston Hughes poem, Harlem, A Dream Deferred. And when the play premiered, it was predominantly more to local Black theater audiences, but it soon began spreading in acclaim and challenged the notion that theater would remain segregated by audience interest. And the play ended up going to Broadway. It was the first Broadway premiere written by a Black woman playwright, and it won the 1959 New York Critics Drama Circle Award for Best Play. And if you have not seen it, they did a film adaptation in 1961 starring Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee. It's about the Younger family, a Black family. The grandmother matriarch inherits a paycheck, and she wants to use it to move the family to a predominantly white neighborhood. The father, played by Sidney Poitier, is wrestling with the notion of this. He's trying to deal with being a Black man in America, raising his son, clashing with his sister-in-law, who has more progressive Black political and artistic aspirations. And the play, and then the film version of it did end up becoming popular in its own right. Poitier and the actress Claudia McNeil were nominated for Golden Globes, and Ruby Dee won the Best Supporting Actress award from the National Board of Review. Now, Hansberry also wrote the screenplay for the film, and she noted that she was having pushback the whole time. She succeeded in it not becoming too whitewashed, but she still had to fight against concessions from the Hollywood studio system that wanted a much more blunted film initially. And she was always very progressive and radical. She was expressing herself, like Josephine Baker, beyond what people thought a woman should do in her time period. And her second play was called The Sign in Sidney Brewston's Window, and it was a play that dealt more forthrightly with leftist politics and creative artists in Greenwich Village. It was a much more ethnically diverse cast. Reviews for it were mixed. Some people kind of thought she was getting too high up in her worldview and that the play was too broad and shaky. And sadly, the last performance of it closed on the day she died. And so she was very integrated in the civil rights movement. She was talking to politicians, activists, artists. And in 1963, she and the writer James Baldwin, also another awesome Black queer person, and other Black activists, there was Jerome Smith from the Freedom Rider Association, Clarence Benjamin Jones, who was an advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the singers and activists and actors Lena Horne and Harry Belafonte. They met with the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was the brother to the then President John F. Kennedy, to implore for a greater federal response to the struggle for civil rights and the outright violence that was going on in the southern Dixiecrat states. And the meeting unfortunately went not as they wanted it to. Kennedy basically had a very just be patient stance. And the meeting ended with Hansberry and Baldwin just leaving the room infuriated. Hansberry was noted as telling Kennedy, look, if you can't understand what this young man, the Freedom Rider Jerome Smith had previously stated on, is saying, then we are without hope at all, because you and your brother are representatives of the best that a white America can offer. And if you are insensitive to this, then there's no alternative except to going out in the streets and chaos. Hansberry definitely duly felt that there should be an uplift for Black young people, but that was as important as an honest and blunt response to the violence that was being perpetrated by white Americans or the outright apathy by other white Americans. Now, by 1964, Hansberry and her husband Nemiroff were divorced. They were still close friends throughout her life, but before their marriage ended officially, Hansberry had begun relationships with women that she had met in Greenwich Village. There was a thriving, low-key community of lesbians. However, she distinctly felt the difference because she was predominantly the only Black woman in a community of white lesbians. She had partners and girlfriends who were sympathetic to the racism that she struggled with and went through, but they ultimately kind of could sympathize up to a point. But she did end up writing anonymous letters and eventually some short fictions for the latter, which was a newspaper put out by the Daughters of Bilitis, which was one of the first mainstream lesbian organizations in America. But the Daughters of Bilitis of the time, they were kind of a bit more conservative, a bit more kind of mainstream, don't rock the boat too much. And she, although she was very grateful for the voice that the newsletter allowed her, she still strode against some of the more restrictive notions. And she was always conflicted whether she could find open love as a woman who felt passionately on issues of against American racism and the international imperialism and war movements that were going on abroad. And she had a series of ongoing writing blocks and reoccurring health issues that kind of led up to creative, mental, and physical blocks and illnesses. She ended up moving into upstate New York. She contemplated maybe giving up the writing life to become a farmer. She enjoyed whiskey apparently a bit too much, and she kind of just questioned what she wanted out of a love life. And then continuing through 1964, she wrote the text for a fundraiser book of photography called The Movement, a documentary struggle for equality for SNCC. That was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was a strong arm in the civil rights movement. And unfortunately, she continued to have ongoing health issues. And on January 12th, 1965, she died at only the age of 34. Her funeral in Harlem was marked by a wealth of Black activists, artists, and citizens paying respect to her despite a huge snowfall. Paul Robeson did the eulogy. Malcolm X attended despite ongoing death threats over his rift from the Nation of Islam. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin, who was unfortunately ill in France, sent remembrances. And she did die of pancreatic cancer. And it was sadly noted that because of her being a woman at that time, she was never told of her doctor what her actual illness was. Her former husband, Nemiroff, was told by the doctor that it was cancer, but she was always apparently kept in the dark. Posthumously, a collection of her speeches and essays was compiled by Nemiroff into the book Young, Gifted, and Black, Lorraine Hansberry in Her Own Words. And then, of course, A Raisin in the Sun has had numerous revivals over the decades, and some of her later plays and writings have also been restaged and released. In 2001, her private papers were released, revealing a wealth of unpublished plays, stories, essays, and also revealing, for the first time, her contact with Daughters of Bilitis and her private letters of explaining her relationship with women as well. And in 2018, Amani Perry released a new biography, Looking for Lorraine, The Radical and Radiant Life of Lorraine Hansberry. And we have a great quote by her: I have come to maturity, as we all must, knowing that greed and malice and indifference to human misery, bigotry and corruption, brutality, and perhaps all above ignorance abound in this world. And the number one document we have, most of these are from the New York Public Library, and Congress, and the Library of Congress. The first one is from Look Magazine. The first two are from Look Magazine. And the third photo there is a photo of her in a protest, and to the right of her is the singer and activist Nina Simone.
We're just going to warn everyone now, we're going to go past 8. These ladies and people are too cool for school, so we got to get you all the info, and if you have a commitment at 8, feel free to watch us on demand. But we're going to keep rolling in just a second, but I just have to ask a question. So imagine when we're going through high school, and I would gamble that we all had A Raisin in the Sun come up in school at some point. Imagine if we had been taught about Lorraine Hansberry being a member of the LGBTQ plus community, because that wasn't, I never even knew that until I was an adult. And even though this was a whole unit in school about Raisin in the Sun, and I'm hopeful that that's changed a lot. And I grew up in a place with super progressive teachers for the time, but the identity of these authors was not really discussed at that depth in the way that we were able to now. Any thoughts or reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that with other writings of hers that have been released, that there's kind of a parallel and contrast as to what she wanted to write about when she was a younger woman and what she wanted to write about as unfortunately not very older woman, but the different life experience she felt as a Black woman, as a Black lesbian. And I mean, you know, she was living in a time where it was the law. I mean, the laws were still very restrictive. She basically
Mm.
probably kept her private life private for her own safety.
Mm. One of the
And there's a
interesting
lovely documentary on Canopy called Lorraine Hansberry, Seen Eyes, Sighted Heart. So definitely check that out.
Cool. I'll put the link in the chat here. One of the things too that was interesting from this period when she was active, you know, if we think about Baldwin and others, like Baldwin was someone who was super out there with things and kind of people knew where he stood. But within these creative communities, everyone's identity was out in the open within those bubbles that were safe spaces, right? And now we live in a world where those safe spaces look different and are a bit, you know, there's more openness that's possible in certain places, like in our country, in certain areas, at the very least. But there's a lot of you know, perspective that can be added to these conversations when we think about, you know, what it mean in the time and what was it to be out within a community or not out. Okay, number 3, another amazing writer. This time we're going to poetry, and that is Audre Lorde.
So, okay, Audre Lorde was born in 1934 in Harlem, New York, to Caribbean immigrant parents, a father from Barbados, a mother from Curacao, and she had a distant and difficult relationship with her parents. Her mother noted that her daughter, Audrey, had darker skin than herself, and she was pretty shy and guarded in communicating with other children and students, but she had a huge passion for poetry. She performed, she memorized, and in 1951, after high school, she began at Hunter College in New York, and she actually published her first poem in 17 magazine. The school magazine apparently thought the poem was too scandalous. And in 1954, she spent a year at the University of Mexico, where she fully embraced her identity and consciousness as a poet and a lesbian woman. And she graduated Hunter in 1959. She worked as a librarian. She got her master's in library sciences at Columbia while she was exploring the lesbian community in Greenwich Village. She wrote poetry. She taught fellow progressive Black conscious students, and she lived a life of poetry as an avenue for her uncompromising voice for Black empowerment, women's liberation, queer liberation, and speaking out against American ills and injustices. At readings, she started to begin her readings with a declaration: I am a Black lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. And she lived on Staten Island, New York from 1972 and 1978. She was writing, publishing, and teaching. And in 1980, with fellow Black lesbian writers Barbara Smith and Sherry Moraga, both who I believe are still living and with us, they co-founded the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. And in 1981, she helped found a group of St. Croix women to combat sexual and intimate partner violence. In 1985, she was off to Cuba with other Black women writers, where they met with local Cuban writers, discussing where the Cuban Revolution stood now for Black women and for lesbian and gay people. And bouncing back a bit to 1984, she had a visiting professorship in West Berlin, where she cultivated a Black feminist movement across racial and international ethnic lines that was dubbed the Afro-German movement. And she returned to Berlin many times up until 1992, teaching and making alliances. There was a 2012 documentary released on this, Audre Lorde, The Berlin Years, 84 to 92. And she also was supportive of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And she embraced the fight and empowerment of national and international struggles against racism, apartheid, homophobia, class discrimination. And in her essay, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, she wrote, those of us who stand outside the circle of society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and making them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And then a little bit of the poem a litany for survival. When we are alone, we are afraid. Love will vanish. Love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid. Our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. She was very much about using your voice, embracing all of your identities, and speaking kind of truth to power, embracing bonds and strengths with other women across race and across different nationalities, different sexualities. She was a huge proponent of love of the self and with other women, emotionally, physically, masturbation. But she was very firm that women should confront and hold accountable within their own selves the fight against systems of racism, patriarchy, sexism, imperialism, environmental degradation, and capitalism. And then in 1980, she had a recurring bout of cancer and she had a mastectomy, and she published the Cancer Journals, a collection of diary entries and some essays. And it dealt with her sense of loss and later rejuvenation. She decried the fact that people kind of pushed her to wear a prosthetic, and she was like, I have one breast. It speaks to the struggle I fought through and lived through, so I'm going to go around with this body that I have. And she really pushed people to question the environmental pollution and the unnatural foods and the capitalism that made these illnesses thrive across the world, and to speak out against industries that just kind of let them complacently be treated but not cured. And she was a lifelong writer. She had so many volumes of poetry. She had the essay collection Sister Outsider, a book that she called a biomythography called Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, that was about her childhood and an early adulthood. She did briefly marry a white gay man in '62, with whom she had 2 children, but by 1970 they were divorced. And she met Frances Clayton, a white lesbian and psychology professor, in 1968. They were lovers till '89, and Clayton was one of many in the lesbian community that helped her through her cancer diagnosis, and they remained close until her death. And in '91, she became the New York State Poet Laureate, and she held the position until her death on November 17th, 1992. Cancer unfortunately reoccurred, and her last partner was Dr. Gloria Joseph, a Black lesbian who she lived with on the island of St. Croix. And yeah, she was definitely a huge champion of intersectional feminist causes. She was noted at quoting, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." Malcolm X knew this. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this. And the Audre Lorde Project, a Brooklyn-based organization for Black LGBTQ New Yorkers that speaks to issues of community strengthening, AIDS and HIV activism, pro-immigrant activism, prison reform, and youth activism, is named after her. And the Kellen Lorde Community Health Center, that is co-named for Lorde and the white gay AIDS activist Michael Collin, is named after both of them, and it is the only healthcare center in New York that offers free medical care specifically to the LGBTQ community. And then we have the documents here. Some of the first photo here is with the fellow lesbian activists, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to say this name right, Meridel Lesueur, and then her fellow lesbian poet, Adrienne Rich. And then the Library of Congress photo of her, the second one there. And then the third photo there is a photo of her with her partner, Frances Clayton.
Wonderful. We're getting wonderful comments in the chat. Thank you, Miss Vivian, saying this is so fascinating and that she's enjoying the event. You know, if anyone is new to the name Audre Lorde, stop everything, go to our catalog and borrow some of Audrey's works. You can get them on ebook or on our print catalog. Audrey is one of the great American poets, up there with Whitman, up there with Thoreau, up there with Emerson, up there with any American poet. She is at the very, very top of that list, along with some other wonderful. I mean, and Whitman is there. You go. That's one of the new editions of her book or of her writings. Whitman was, of course, also another member of the queer community, one of our native Washingtonian hometown poets. If you ever go up the metro at DuPont Circle, you'll see some Whitman text there. What's important to think about when we think about great poets like Whitman and Audre Lorde, think about the activism beyond just the poetry, and think about the way that the poetry is being used as a vehicle for the activism. And if you were to look at Whitman and Audre Lorde together, one could consider, okay, what kind of impact did Whitman's work have, and what kind of impact did Audre Lorde's work have? And with a poet who is much more embedded in activism movements, it could be, one could argue, and I'm not trying to say that this is the interpretation of Audre Lorde, this is just a personal opinion, but Audre Lorde as a poet whose work drove activism and drove social progress, in many ways that is more impactful to the actual progression of American society than kind of the high arts and letters that have been elevated in the Ivory Tower, for example. So check out Audre Lorde. There's a recording of her reading her poetry available through Library of Congress. It's available online. I've posted the link in the chat for you to have a listen to. They have a wonderful poetry collection. For much of the 20th century, poets who would visit the Library of Congress would make a stop to the recording studio and read many of their poems. And that's why we can look back at folks like June Jordan, Audre Lorde, and actually listen to their voices reading their poems at a certain point in their lives, which just doesn't necessarily mean that's the definitive interpretation of it by the writer, but that is the reflection of them in a moment that gives some insight. Okie dokie. The next figure is one that we all get very excited about. Iconic photograph here on the left, Miss Marcia.
Yes, I should give a little background information. I grew up right outside of New York City. It's where I spent my late childhood and my teenage years. And as a young queer kid, I definitely went to the Village every chance I got and loved to soak up the culture. And the reason I'm saying this is because I was right there, and yet I never heard of this woman. It was not taught to me at schools. The older queer folks that I knew were not telling me about this woman. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to learn so much about her life in the research that I did for this program. So I'm happy to share things about her life. So she was born in 1945 in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is not far from New York City. As many families were, her family were unsupportive to even hostile about her gender identity and the fact that she felt better when she wore women's clothing. And so after high school, she moved to New York City, as many young queer people did, to live her truth. She adopted the name Marcia P. Johnson. The P stands for Pay No Mind, so Marcia Pay No Mind Johnson. At the time, she identified as a drag queen and transvestite. This is before the term transgender. She had a particular point of view in an interview. She discussed, her definition of what a drag queen was, and her definition of the difference between a transvestite and a transsexual. Now we don't really make much of that distinction, but at the time that was considered, very radical, very progressive. So she started waiting tables in Greenwich Village. And before long, like many young queer people, she was falling into step with street hustlers. And she began living on the streets and was a very active sex worker. She experienced, as many sex workers did and do, particularly if they are women of color, experienced a tremendous amount of violence from both clients and the police. She would actually be arrested over 100 times in her lifetime. But after moving to Greenwich Village, she co-founded a nonprofit called STAR, which stood for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And it was specifically designed to protect Black queer women who were assigned male at birth. She also was a member of the Gay Liberation Front, or the GLF, which was a very prominent organization at the time. So her activism started a long time ago, and she certainly advocated for sex workers and for sex work in general for queer and straight people. Everybody knows Marsha P. Johnson now was a celebrated figure in the Stonewall riots in 1969, which was at the Stonewall Inn. For anybody who's unfamiliar with the history, just a quick and dirty version was that people would go there to live their truth and just live their best lives. And cops, when they needed to fulfill a quota or needed to crack down on a specific law, like, for example, there was a law against cross-dressing, dressing in a gender that was opposite to the one that you were perceived to be or were assigned to be. And so the police would come and do raids on queer establishments to basically just rustle some feathers and say, okay, we're doing the work. On this one particular night, the police came and were very abusive, and basically everybody just couldn't take it anymore. And they fought back against the police. There was a riot. It is considered to be a seminal event in queer history worldwide, but certainly in the United States. As my colleague Nick mentioned, queer people have been here forever and doing wonderful things, but we really hyper kind of focus in on this one moment. So as far as Marsha P. Johnson's participation in it, while she was a vocal and unapologetic protester, she is rumored to have thrown the first brick. Some myths say that she actually threw a shot glass into a mirror and screamed, "I got my civil rights." Marsha P. Johnson then the following year marched in the first Pride Parade. It was a gay rights protest in 1970. So it was not, happy rainbow, thumping music, giveaways, and happy hours. This was a straight up political act. She also was a performer. She played with a band called Hot Peaches, was mixed different group of queer people. She became a pretty staunch advocate for homeless LGBTQ people. And this was at a time, we're talking about the 70s in New York, which, if anybody knows anything about the 70s in New York, it was kind of a dark time. And nobody was really caring for these people. These people were completely invisible, completely disappeared. And Marsha P. Johnson was spending all of her time advocating for this population. Famously, she sat for Andy Warhol portraits. I believe there are some prints that are still being shown of Marsha P. Johnson. She was also known as the mayor of Christopher Street. So Christopher Street is a very popular stretch in the Village. And she was just so well known there and so well loved. And she was such an advocate and an ambassador for the culture that was growing and trying to seek safety and acceptance. So she was called the mayor of Christopher Street. She was also known as a queen mother of drag balls. For anybody who's unfamiliar with the drag ball culture, it dates back to 200 years ago, actually, in the United States. Where people would come and put on their best clothes and pose and live their best lives. And the queen mother was somebody who essentially would take people into their chosen family, provide guidance and mentorship for younger queer folks, and try to keep them safe and let them know what their rights were, help to keep them in good health. She did serve as the Pride Parade Grand Marshal in the early 70s. A lot of people may not be aware that she also struggled with mental health issues, which I think is so important to talk about if we're going to talk about the intersectionality of Black queer women, is to talk about disability. So she did suffer from some depression and anxiety, despite being this very exuberant, super passionate person. And it was kind of reported by people who knew her well that she had a violent, aggressive side when she was pushed to like the limits of high stress. Marsha P. Johnson would take leftover flowers after sleeping under tables, which were used for sorting flowers in the flower district of Manhattan. And she started wearing these crowns of fresh flowers, which now, has become an iconic claim to power for young queer people and allies, frankly. So her activism did not stop there. She was an activist with ACT UP in the 1980s. So she was advocating for AIDS patients. This was during the time where queer men particularly were getting sick and dying of AIDS in droves, and the government was not acknowledging that this was an issue that needed attention on the national stage. Sadly, Marsha died in 1992 in relative obscurity in New York City under mysterious circumstances. So shortly after the 1992 Pride Parade, her body was discovered floating in the Hudson River. And the police initially ruled the death a suicide, but her friends and other members of the community who knew her very well insisted that she was not suicidal. And they noted that the back of her head had a massive wound. According to Sylvia Rivera, their friend Bob Kohler believed that Johnson had committed suicide due to an ever-increasing fragile state. But then they also disputed that. Those who were close to Marsha considered the death suspicious. And while she was struggling mentally, they just couldn't see her committing suicide. If you are interested in learning more about the life and death of Marsha P. Johnson, watch The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. It's a 2017 documentary on Netflix. And I do want to note that the investigation was finally reopened, looking into her death in 2012. I have not heard of any progress that's been made, but it was taken off the books as a suicide. 1 in 50 Americans inducted into the National LGBTQ Wall of Honor at the Stonewall National Monument in 2019 was Marsha P. Johnson. There now exists the nonprofit, the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, which was founded in her name, advocating for Black trans folks. This was back in 2019. The East Side River Park in Brooklyn was renamed Marsha P. Johnson National Park in 2020. And a monument to Marsha is to be erected in New York City, hopefully by this year. In 2020, a statue of her was declared that it would be erected in her hometown city hall in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is, just a wonderful way to remember somebody who was such a pioneer, so influential, smashing barriers left and right, advocating for the least of us in society. And again, I find it very disturbing that young people are not being taught about Marsha P. Johnson's life and work in schools. And I hope that any young people who are watching this will come away with a little bit more knowledge about her life. So just to take a look quickly at the artifacts. So this is an iconic portrait of Marsha P. Johnson. You see it everywhere. I was able to track this one back to NBC News. I even contacted the Marsha P. Johnson Institute and asked, did anybody know the background of this particular photograph? When was it taken? Who took it? Where exactly was it taken? It's kind of a mystery. In the second picture, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are protesting at a gay rights rally in New York City. This is part of the New York Public Library's collection. This picture was taken in 1973. And the third one, also from 1973, is Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera marching in the Pride Parade in New York City. This photograph is used courtesy of the LGBT Community Center National History Archive.
Thank you so much. One of the important aspects of Marsha's life was the fact that Marsha was also HIV positive. And, in addition to all of the work that Marsha had done advocating for the community, to be directly impacted by the biggest crisis that faced the community really helped kind of continue and perpetuate her work and advocacy. And it's important. If we think about Marsha's life and when Marsha lived and was active, she was a part of the evolution of the LGBTQ movement, and in many ways one of the few voices representing her community within the LGBTQ plus community. And while we're getting to a point now where Marsha is more widely known of as a figure within the LGBTQ plus community, the fact that she and Sylvia are still propped up as like the only examples of their communities is hugely problematic. And we have to do better to go beyond just looking, we're understanding Marsha and we're understanding Sylvia, which is tremendously important. But let's use their stories to dive in more and learn about additional people who lived with them and around their time and who have been carrying this work forward. And we're going to talk in a bit about someone who's more contemporary that has carried on this torch. But always important to remember that these are just examples of the work of many people that was happening at the time that they were living. Okie doke. Next up is number 5, Sylvia Rivera.
And I just want to thank Rebecca. She did a lot of great coverage of Stonewall and the background behind it. And because there is going to be a bit of overlap with, since Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were contemporaries. So Sylvia Rivera was born July 2nd, 1951 to parents of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent. Her father abandoned the family early on. Her mother died by suicide when Sylvia was 3, and she was raised primarily by a grandmother that was unaccepting of her femme identity. So she left home for the streets of New York when she was probably around 10 or 11, and she was quickly swept up into a found family of other kicked out trans and queer kids. Excuse me. And unfortunately, very quickly at a young age, sex work became a necessary means of her survival for Sylvia. And so on the first night of the Stonewall riots, there is a bit of a debate on whether Rivera was there the first and the second night, just the second night, or at all. Black trans activist Miss Major Griffin Gracie has wryly insisted that neither Rivera nor Johnson were present at Stonewall, but she recognizes that the impact that they had afterwards kind of makes the point a bit moot. And Rivera initially joined one of the groups born out of Stonewall, the Gay Activist Alliance, but she eventually found their actions and representation too assimilationist. So, as Rebecca previously noted, she and Johnson co-founded STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. It was both a literal house shelter and a network for giving financial help and a physical place and food for other and younger Black and brown trans people and youth. And they both kind of floated through the mainstream gay communities, but they always felt that there wasn't enough attention and resources being given to the least of the community. And at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade, both Rivera and Johnson were kind of banned. Like, their presence was considered too controversial. The presence of trans people and gender non-conforming people was considered too controversial. But Rivera ended up pushing her way to the stage and the mic, and she gave a several-minute speech imploring the gay male and lesbian community to support their trans siblings and to reject assimilation, and respectability, and demand that all gay people acknowledge the activism that trans people were working for, that were helping in concrete issues of poverty and civil rights and police abuse and imprisonment. And Rivera was unfortunately greeted by boos, but she finished her speech. And she noted later in her life, around that time, was when STAR basically crumbled as an organization. And also in the late 70s, an attempt was made by Rivera and other members of the Gay Liberation Front that Rebecca previously mentioned, that was a more progressive gay activist group. They pushed for inclusionment of trans identities in a New York non-discrimination basis of sexuality bill, but that was ignored by the Gay Activist Alliance, and then the bill itself did not come into passage until 1986. And as Rebecca previously noted, when Marsha P. Johnson was found dead in 1992, Rivera was insistent that it was not a suicide. She continued her own work for trans people, homeless youth, and people with AIDS. And Rivera herself was often homeless. She lived sometimes in encampments by the New York piers. Because of the harassment and abuse she suffered, she drifted in and out of substance abuse. And even at some points, she had to kind of detransition, as it were, to survive on the streets. But she continued her activism even as she clashed with established gay leaders and different organizations. She worked with the Metropolitan Community Church of New York, assisting with the homeless and hunger outreach. And after her death, the church's food pantry and youth shelter was renamed the Sylvia Rivera Food Pantry and Sylvia's Place. And in her last years, New York kind of rediscovered her, gave her some of her due acknowledgement, and they honored her in the 2000 New York Pride Parades. And she kind of expressed some fluidity throughout her life. In a 2002 essay, she identified both as a gay man, gay girl, drag queen, and street queen, as we were saying before, terms that are not used today by the wider trans community. And she was quoted as saying, "I'm tired of being labeled. I don't even like the label transgender. I'm tired of living with labels. I just want to be who I am. I am Sylvia Rivera. Ray Rivera left home at the age of 10 to become Sylvia, and that's who I am." And unfortunately, she did die but in February 19th, 2002, by her partner, Julia Murray. And in subsequent years, along with Johnson, they've both kind of been seen as the founding mothers of the queer movement in New York. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project was named in honor of her. They fight for legal representation and resources for Black and people of color and trans and queer people, and against systematic racism, legal discrimination, and poverty. And she was the first trans person to have a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And then, as Rebecca had previously stated, in 2017, their documentary, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, premiered, directed by David France. However, the Black trans artist and filmmaker Tourmaline has stated that France actually used and lifted research and footage that she had uncovered. And so it's always been the question as to who in the queer community tells the story of other members of the community. And so for the documents here, we have a document from the New York Times Public Library, kind of semi-famous photo of Sylvia by a New York fountain in the Village. And then the second one here is, I believe, Getty AP Images. And this is a color photo of Rivera at a ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power protest in the 1980s. And then the final photo, again from the New York Public Library, is a photo of Sylvia in her later years alongside fellow trans sisters and activists.
Awesome. One of the things that you would note as a reader or consumer of materials is that there's not as much out there in terms of books about both Sylvia and Marcia when we compare them to like Lorraine Hansberry or Audre Lorde. And this is likely in part your reflection of trans identity has not been represented as much in publishing as other groups within the LGBTQ plus community. And in fact, Lorraine Hansberry is not necessarily even being represented in literature and scholarship because of her queer identity, though there's some of that now. There's biographies about her because Raisin in the Sun is huge and so many people interact with that. So for example, in our collection, there are some books where you can learn about Sylvia, but they're compilations of short biographies of people. There's one book by Sarah Prager that's really cool called Queer There and Everywhere, 23 People Who Changed the World. There's also another book that's in English and Spanish that's about Latinas and Latinos and Latin people who have shaped the United States. And Sylvia is perhaps the only member of the LGBTQ plus community that's represented in that book. So a hugely important figure, again, represents an enormous part of the Latin diaspora and also the queer diaspora. And it's really great that we got to learn a bit about her tonight. So thank you, Chris, for that. And last but not least is a woman who needs no introduction, but we're going to introduce her anyways because she's that fabulous. And that is Miss Laverne Cox.
Yes, everybody buckle up, because to say that this woman is very accomplished is a complete understatement. So I had learned so much in my research about Laverne Cox. I mean, I knew she was fabulous and wonderful and smart and active, but I just had no idea how many firsts she accomplished. So I'll go ahead and dive into her life. She was born in 1972 in Mobile, Alabama. So she's a late Gen Xer. She was born to a single mother who was a public school teacher. She also had an identical twin brother. She was mercilessly bullied by peers and teachers, which again, we're talking the 70s in Mobile, Alabama. That's not a huge shock. And unfortunately, it's not much of a shock either that, like many queer youth, particularly trans youth, she attempted suicide at the young age of 11. In her early life, she was very active in the African American Episcopal Church. She was noted as an avid reader and an excellent student. She went to several prestigious colleges and universities where she majored in theater and dance. And again, like many young, talented queer people, she settled in the East Village in New York City. She was heavily involved in the punk rock and gender nonconforming scene and came out as a trans woman in her 20s. She worked as a drag queen at that time. So if we're going to fast forward from like the mid 90s all the way to 2007, Laverne starts to get her first TV spots. She accepted a GLAAD Media Award, which that's still a very coveted award, but it certainly was back then, for I Want to Work for Diddy in 2009, which was a reality television show. In 2010, she was the first transgender person to star and produce their own show, which was called Transform Me. And then she started getting larger film roles in 2012. So then in 2013, Orange is the New Black airs with this multi-dimensional character of Sophia, who is trans and is doing time in a woman's prison. And she helps, with the beautification rituals that are available to women who are languishing in prison. In 2014, she had a famous interview with Carmen Carrera, who many know is a Rue girl, formerly a very celebrated drag queen, now an out trans woman. This was on the Katie Couric show. And she spoke out against issues that were affecting trans women specifically. So if we're thinking almost 20 years ago, this was, quite a wave to make on a major network television show. Then she was the first trans person on the cover of Time magazine. She was the first transgender performer to be nominated for an Emmy, I believe for Orange is the New Black. And then she made the cover of Essence magazine's annual body issue, which smashes all kinds of barriers. She later executive produced her documentary Laverne Cox Presents the T Word, which earned her an Emmy in 2015, which she was the first trans woman to win an Emmy for executive producing. She was the first trans woman to be featured in Allure magazine's famous Nudes annual issue. And then she made the cover for Entertainment Weekly. She was Glamour magazine's Woman of the Year. She was People magazine's World's Most Beautiful Women list. And for a trans woman of color to make such a mainstream list is certainly notable, but definitely giving hope to a lot of young trans people out there. She was named Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People. And that was actually written by Jazz Jennings, who you may know is a young trans person who was coming of age on a reality television series called I Am Jazz. We also have I Am Jazz, which is a biography for children about Jazz Jennings' young life. We had that available at the library. And then again, Laverne Cox was the first trans person ever to get a wax figure at Madame Tussauds. So that could be a whole program right there. But we're going to move on to 2016. She joined the Human Rights Council's video honoring victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting, which we should mention just this past Saturday marks the 5-year anniversary of the massacre at the Pulse nightclub. And I know that recently Congress has voted to make that a national memorial. In 2017, Laverne was nominated for another Emmy for acting in Orange is the New Black. She also joined a notable ACLU narrated video called Time Marches Forward and So Do We. She was featured in Taylor Swift's video, You Need to Calm Down, which made a lot of waves at the time for including so many gender nonconforming people. She was the first trans woman to be featured on the cover of British Vogue at the invitation of Meghan Markle. And she was the first trans person to play a regular trans character on network television in the series Doubt. Then in 2018, she's the first trans person on the cover of Cosmopolitan South Africa, excuse me. And she famously made quite the statement at the 2019 Emmys. She brought ACLU lawyer Chase Strangio as her date, and she had her purse adorned with pro-LGBTQ plus legislative references. She, at that time, was guest writing for the Huffington Post and The Advocate. And she started to become a very sought-after public speaker. She received an honorary doctorate from the New York School in New York City. And she executive produced the Netflix award-winning documentary Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen, which aired in 2020. And sadly, this is the only person on this list who is still living. But the best part about that is that Laverne has far more barriers to knock down and communities to uplift. So all the artifacts that we have to share with Laverne and her fabulous presence are some of just a handful of the magazines whose cover she has graced. So in the first one, she is on Time magazine, and then her famous inclusion in Entertainment Weekly, her groundbreaking inclusion in the Essence magazine's Bodies issues, and then being on the cover of Cosmo as well. She has a lot of quotes because she She has a lot to say, and she says it better than almost anyone I can think of. But she said, healthcare for trans women is a necessity. It is not elective. It is not cosmetic. It is life-saving.
Awesome. Despite all of that, you have just had a taste of how significant Laverne is. And I think one of the coolest things about Laverne is that Laverne uses the platform that she has gotten to empower others and to feature others. And a perfect example is the most recent documentary that she did that was big time was, I shared the link in the chat. I was, and I'll get the name up. But so in that documentary, Laverne documents the history of trans visibility or discrimination against trans people in the entertainment business, and how for so long and even still today, trans people who are, or trans characters who are represented in media are oftentimes represented in tokenistic ways of the sex worker. Sometimes what does it mean when a cisgendered person or plays a trans character, and further some of those negative perception tropes and stereotypes. And in that documentary, Laverne talks about herself, but it's more about look at all these other amazing people who have been trailblazers over the decades. Not just me. Yes, I understand that I'm part of that, Laverne says, but here are all these amazing stories that you also need to know about and know how to support. So she's a hugely important figure. And in history, looking back, there is a lineage from Marsha, from Sylvia, through other people to Laverne in this moment that we're living in now. And there are many others. Of course, the TV show Pose has been another really important moment. If we think about media history and representing the progress, we think about shows like Nip Tuck, Will and Grace, Queer as Folk, Orange is the New Black, Pose. These are shows that have been indicators of the way that society is progressing. While each of those shows is hugely problematic in some ways, as is the fact of life with anything, they do represent kind of a barometer of where society is moving towards, which is or a barometer of where society has moved to, and media is catching up in many ways. So, well, this has been a very, very deep and rich conversation, and I know we're way past our anticipated time. But before I ask a kind of a closing discussion prompt, just want to thank Rebecca and Chris for all of the work that they do at the library to make sure that the library is a welcoming space for everyone. And that includes the LGBTQ plus community, that includes trans women of color, that includes cis white men of whatever age. And, in order for us to support everyone, we have to make sure that those who are the most vulnerable in our community have a space, whether it be virtually or in person or via the phone, that they know that they can reach out for support. And that's something that the library here in Prince George's County is really proud of committing to do at the forefront of all of our work, is make sure that our spaces are welcoming to everyone. So, closing prompt. Why are these leaders not elevated in our cultural consciousness, and how have specific intersectional populations been left out of this LGBTQ plus cultural tapestry that we just had a taste?
I think, and this is just my perception and opinion, it's the fact that we tend to elevate the white male individual, cis straight, as the hero, but it's also that whole thing too. It's that only one individual can be the hero or the center of the traditional American story. And as Rebecca brought up very well with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, they were amazing people, but there were still so many people, Black trans women, Latinx trans straight kids, whose stories we don't know. And I'm sure many of them had probably just as fascinating lives, and hopefully a lot of them are still living and thriving. Maybe they're just making strides in their communities in smaller, quieter ways.
I would certainly agree with Chris. I would also, thinking back to like Lorraine Hansberry, I would not call that just exclusion. I would call that straight washing. I would say that, you know, we are, and in the case of Josephine Baker as well, and bi-erasure is such a thing, where we would rather remember these women as straight passing. But as we know from our trans siblings, that it's not about what you pass as, it's about who you are, and your legacy and what you want to create. I do want to shout out a local queer woman activist from Prince George's County, Cassie Morris, who is helps head the LGBTQ Dignity Project. She is actually organizing some of the first Pride events that we've ever had here in Prince George's County. And I'm just so grateful for the work that she does every day, and for the partnership that the LGBTQ Dignity Project has shown the library system.
Awesome. One of the other things that comes to mind too is like we've seen these figures that we've talked about today, and there's a common thread that they're either artists or activists, or they're artist activists and all in one. And I think you know, an important point for us to leave the viewers with is that queer people are part of every part of our communities. And you know, there's the latest data out this year identifies over 5% of the population in the U.S. as identifying as queer, and that's from Gallup. But there are many other studies, if you kind of try and estimate the folks who might not be out, which is still a huge number of people, that we are in excess of 10% of the population. So that means anytime you walk into a room, at least 1 in 10 people or 10 in 100 people are most likely queer, whether they're out or not, or on their coming out journey. And it is not acceptable to pretend like queer people are not part of your community. It is not acceptable to pretend that queer people are not part of your industry, whether we're talking about professional trades or government agencies or agriculture or art or education. Queer people are everywhere. We are not going anywhere, right? Queer people have persisted throughout all of history, no matter what challenge and discrimination and violence has been directed at them. And we have a long way to go. And we see that there are challenges to the civil rights laws that are in place and that have been in place for decades. And it is not hyperbole to say that votes, and I'm going to be apolitical, I know I'm almost at the line, votes have an impact on the daily lives of LGBTQ plus people. This is fact, right? You know, if someone is coming for my rights to be here, like there are dozens of states in which I could be fired without cause, without justification, just because I am openly out. And that is insane. And it's going to take all of us coming together, all of us having the bravery and the courage to share our stories when we're ready to bring more people along, especially those who are in positions of privilege and positions of power and who might be cis heterosexual white men, cis heterosexual white women. We have to take this at a relationship level, one person at a time, to show that all of us share the same human dignity and the same rights to be here and to attempt to thrive and just exist and be loved. And these are all, you know, things that can be perceived as controversial, but they're not. It's possible to support human rights in a way that conflicts with your personal views. It is possible for institutions to support the dignity of all of their constituents without compromising freedom of expression that everyone has the, you know, the birthright to in this country. even though our country fails us on many levels with honoring and protecting that. But I will get off my soapbox, which, oh, thank you, Rebecca, on the private chat. If you want to hear more of that, we've got a rally coming up on June 25th. It's a memorial press conference is going to be in Fairmont Heights, where one of our branches is there at 3 p.m. That is an event that the LGBTQ Dignity Project is hosting with folks from throughout the community, including the library. You'll also see our friends from the library at the Rainbow on the Harbor event on Saturday, June 26th at 8 p.m. That is a big day for the library. If you would like to join our Summer at Your Library kickoff event at all branches that are open, that event is from 1 to 4 that day, and then you can come down to National Harbor, have dinner in between, go to Rezo Mexicano. It's a great option. There are other great places down there, and then join us for Rainbow on the Harbor at 8 o'clock. We are going to be at Pride in the Park in College Park, Maryland on Sunday, June 27th at 2 p.m. And then on Tuesday, June 28th, we'll be participating in State Attorneys Aisha Brave Boys LGBTQ Plus Forum, which is at 6 p.m. and will be virtual. We also have an amazing array of events this week for Juneteenth, which I'd like to just highlight briefly. Today, we had a wonderful read aloud for children at 10 a.m. Tonight, there was also a cooking celebration honoring Black culture and cuisine, which you can catch on demand now on our YouTube page. Tomorrow night, we're going to have an author event with, Juneteenth cooking is Tuesday. I got ahead of myself by a day. Juneteenth cooking is Tuesday the 15th at 6 p.m. On Wednesday, we have a wonderful author joining us. His name is Dwayne Ratliff, and his book is a fictional account of a coming-of-age story of a Black queer teenager growing up in Baltimore, and he'll be interviewed by Michelle Hamiel, our COO for Public Services. On Thursday, we are presenting Voices of Woodlawn, which is a poetry and performance event looking at the legacy of a local plantation and how that has impacted people's lives. It features some wonderful local poets, including our own Board of Trustees member, Hiram LaRue. On Friday at noon, we have a STEM program on DNA in your family tree, and this will have a special focus on how we can learn about African-American roots and heritage in the United States. On Friday, we have book talk focused on Octavia Butler's Kindred at 7 p.m. And then on Monday, we're going to be celebrating Black Music Appreciation Month with poet and jazz artist T.J. Anderson III, whose father is a very distinguished composer and performer as well. So we have a lot going on. And Pride, we have a ton of events at the library coming up. Chris and Rebecca have been a part of the planning of all of that. We encourage everyone to visit our website at pgcmls.info/pride for the LGBTQ content, and then /Juneteenth for the Juneteenth content. One of the things that one of my last parting thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to impart some final words of wisdom, is that we operate in our daily lives and we make a lot of assumptions about the people around us. And for example, before I had a chance to speak to Rebecca and Chris on a more personal level, I didn't know that they were members of the LGBTQ plus community, and they are also very brave in allowing us to kind of discuss that openly. But there are many people who are on a journey towards figuring out themselves, which we all do, whether you're queer or not, right? But for queer people especially, it can be very difficult. And at any given moment, you might be working with colleagues who you assume are straight, who you assume are cisgendered. You don't know that they are. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could all start from a point of grace where we do not assume anything about anyone, and we are just open to honoring their existence in the way that they're showing up, and letting the individual guide how we get to know them better. And wouldn't it be amazing if we could get to a point in time where trans people don't have to out themselves, and how amazing that would be. And so that's my final thought. I'll throw it over to Chris and Rebecca for their final wisdom.
Thank you so much, Nick, for going off on that, because people need to hear it. I just would like to close by saying that I got so much out of this research. I knew quite a bit about these women, but I learned so much more. I would love to promote our online resource, Gale Biography and Context, where you can learn a lot about these women and other LGBTQ women activists who have been just integral and critical to where we are now. And I can definitely say, as somebody who, I will just say I'm 40 years old, and things have changed a lot since 1980. And I can't imagine that it's not going to, I just expect the best. I really think it's going to continue to improve. Like Nick said, I hope that people start coming from place of grace. I hope that we destroy the default, which is largely white, cis, and male. And I just want to say, protect trans kids now.
I want to thank Rebecca and Nick. Could not have done this event and all of this research without them. And just looking back, I definitely grew up in a very white cis childhood, but it really was learning about Black queer women and Black queer men like Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, who was one of the key organizers of the 1963 Civil Rights March. You know, these were people who had a different life experience from me, but I've learned so much from their words and their wisdom and their artistry and honestly their humor too. So just, and echoing Rebecca, you know, our youth, whether they're our biological family or the kids we're around in the schools that are near us, you know, kids are the future, and kids listen every single moment to the littlest things you say. So teach them to embrace every child, whether they're trans, whether they're Black, whether they're Latinx, whether they're Asian. Just teach them to embrace each other.
Awesome. And on a morbid note, I'm just going to remind people that trans women of color are being murdered on a very regular basis in this country. We've seen the headlines in places like the Middle East, for example, where queer people are punished for being queer by being sentenced to death and being executed in horrific ways. While it might not be happening on that extent in this country, it still is happening in this country in other ways, and it is unacceptable. Any member of the LGBTQ plus community, and I've been at things where I've seen very pitiful representations, cis white gay men at marches for people other than their own type within the LGBTQ plus community. And we've all got to just open our eyes, learn, kind of gradually become more okay with being uncomfortable with kind of our lack of understanding in situations, and just lead with empathy and sympathy. And, you know, nobody wants anyone to be hurt. Well, we hope for no one to want that. Some people unfortunately do because they have strange things going on. But, you know, libraries are the number one place where we are here for everyone, and we are going to be a safe space. And if someone messes with our space and tries to make it unsafe, you have a wall of people who are literally going to put their bodies on the line, figuratively and literally in some cases, to protect the people who come to us for sanctuary. And, you know, one of the things that's been really striking recently to me is the way that pride flags are being flown at U.S. embassies again, and including in countries where you can be punished with death for being queer. And that, what does that signal mean to the rest of the world, to show very outwardly in the most provocative way that the United States stands for the rights of LGBTQ plus people around the country? We don't always honor that in our policies, but there are little steps along the way, and change is always going to be incremental. But when it's life or death, we all have a responsibility to step up more visibly and step outside of our comfort zones to stand up for others, because you know, when there are trends like trans women of color being murdered and attacked, our silence is complicit in allowing that to happen, and we've all got to use our privilege as much as we can to try and address that. So with that, this is your reminder that Pride was a riot, and it continues to be an opportunity for us to, yes, celebrate progress, but also take stock of where we are and plot for the future. And libraries have come a long way with queer issues. There are a lot of libraries that are not where we are in our library system, and we've all got to keep working, doing the fight and keeping in good trouble, as Representative John Lewis would like us to. So, Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Shout out and love for Miss Vivian, who's our #1 fan. And thanks again to Rebecca and Chris. We hope you all stay safe. Come visit the library. If you have not gotten a COVID vaccine yet, you can call us and we will help you find a place that is convenient to you to get one. That number is going to be in the chat in a second. And otherwise, we will see you again soon. Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride. Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Pride. Happy Juneteenth. Take care of each other.